Hey everybody, I'm Amanda with DevExpress and welcome to Using TypeScript and DevExpress ASP.NET presented by DevExpress Technical Evangelist Paul Usher and DevExpress Web Program Manager Mehul Harry. In today's session, they'll provide a gentle introduction into using TypeScript on your next ASP.NET project. During this presentation, you'll see them explain the basics of TypeScript with an overview of the language, features, benefits, and tooling, show how easy it is to implement the definitions file into a DevExpress project and what it is, and create a simple takeaway project on which you can practice and hone your own TypeScript skills. This session is being recorded and it will be available on our DevExpress YouTube channel later today. And we will also do a live Q&A at the end of this presentation. Just type your questions in the GoToWebinar control panel at any time throughout the broadcast. All right, thank you so much for joining us. I will now hand things over to Paul and Mehul.
Thank you very much, Amanda, and good morning, everyone. Welcome to Using TypeScript with DevExpress ASP.NET. And today, as Amanda mentioned, I'm co-presenting with our Program Manager for Web, Mr. Mehul Harry. So good morning, Mehul.
Hey, good morning, Paul.
How you doing?
Oh, excellent, my friend. I am happy that you've agreed to help present this webinar, as you have done a couple of TypeScript webinars already. And so you'll play the role of the expert and I'll play the role of the beginner, which I am with TypeScript.
And it's been a while since you and I actually got to do a presentation together.
It has, and I'm excited that we'll get this opportunity again.
Let's take a look then at how we're going to run this today. I'll do a bit of an intro into TypeScript, running through the features, benefits, tooling. Now, tooling really is just Visual Studio for this session. And then I'm going to hand it back to you, Mehul, so that you can take everybody through how to implement the TypeScript definition files for our products and creating a small takeaway project.
Absolutely, and we're going to use existing code. We'll post it on a blog post afterwards, but it's really interesting because you obviously think of TypeScript, with client side, but I think when you're going to see with our ASP.NET controls, it's something you're going to want to take a look at. So absolutely, Paul.
So the first question, of course, is why use TypeScript instead of JavaScript? Now, before I answer that, I want to highlight something that's, I suppose, bothering me a little bit. There's still such a large number of projects being created with ASP.NET Web Forms as well as MVC, and I think sometimes developers don't realize or understand that TypeScript is a perfect fit even for those server-side technologies. There's so many powerful controls, and you've only got to look at our range to see the different things that we provide for that server-side technology, that you can provide a rich user experience by implementing some JavaScript or TypeScript on that client side. TypeScript offers a number of benefits. For example, well, it's based as a superset of JavaScript. If you're working on large migration projects, say from server-side to client-side, it's perfect. It allows you to stay away from some of that spaghetti code that quite often will happen with the natural progression of TypeScript. Obviously, it works with any browser, any host, or operating system. And, of course, it's open source. Now, I've got here that there is good tool support. And one of the big things here is the introduction of IntelliSense. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit later on. But to answer the question in a little more detail, let's focus on one important fact. And that is that JavaScript is actually has been standardized through the ECMAScript standards. Now, the reason I think it's important is we have to remember not all the browsers support all of the features of the newer standards, such as classes, modules, Lambda expressions, etc. But because TypeScript is transpiled, and I'll explain that shortly, you can actually create your TypeScript code using those new cool features, but output the JavaScript based on either version 3, version 5, or 6 of those ECMAScript standards. Now, I mentioned that TypeScript is a superset of JavaScript, which quite literally means you can take your .js source file, rename it to a .ts, which is the TypeScript extension, and with that newly renamed file, actually transpile it back to JavaScript in essence. So you can take your existing JavaScript rename the file, add some TypeScript to it, and then do the transpilation, and you're going to end up with your original code untouched and your TypeScript code converted through to JavaScript. And I'm going to show you an example of exactly that shortly. Now the key benefit is being able to write your code with those latest features and target those older browsers, which already sounds like a great reason to get started with TypeScript. But one of the things that I want to add are some of the following benefits. Now I've mentioned the word transpile a few times already, so let me explain that. Unlike a traditional compile that attempts to produce, say, machine code or machine level code from a source file, the transpile process translates, for want of a better word, these TypeScript syntax directly into JavaScript, so that the file that gets run on the browser is just that. It's JavaScript. On top of that, you're going to get the added benefits of static typing and type inference, encapsulation, really cool things like support for constructors and lambdas, as well as that IntelliSense and other major benefits. Now I'm pretty sure that even the most headstrong anti-JavaScript C# developer can start to be warm to the idea of using JavaScript inside their project. Now another question that I often hear is, why not use something like CoffeeScript or Clojure or Dart? And I think the important thing to remember here is that TypeScript is that superset of JavaScript, whereas the other JavaScript-esque languages mean that you're going to have to move off the beaten track. And you've got to think in terms of future-proofing your project. Will they be around in 5 or so years? Will there be developers able to support your projects if you go down that path? Whereas the benefit of TypeScript is that you end up with plain old JavaScript. Another compelling reason to choose TypeScript is the optional, and I want to quote optional here, type safety, as well as type inference. Now it's entirely up to you as a developer how tight you want that type safety to be used. And it's no secret that there's a lot of bugs introduced into JavaScript because of the dynamic nature of the language. Now, finally, before I head over to Visual Studio, I'm going to create a couple of examples. I want to mention the tooling because IntelliSense inside such as Visual Studio, VS Code, Sublime Text, with the use of TypeScript really cuts down on the discoverability time for finding methods, properties, events. So you actually get to spend more time writing your code than you do looking up on reference material. And I think that's really one major point when working on larger projects with third-party tools such as our ASP.NET controls. Now what I'm going to do is jump over to Visual Studio where I have an empty web project. And we're going to start by just adding a TypeScript file into this project. If I right-click on my project, come down to Add, you're going to see that I've got TypeScript as an option inside the context menu. I'll call this one Hello World. And you'll see that we have that .ts extension that I mentioned before, as well as the fact that Visual Studio obviously has full support for TypeScript. Now, if you were creating this project from scratch, you'd also be prompted if you want to include something such as TypeScript definitions for jQuery or other embedded components. I've got my browser, I've got my code window, and we're going to start by showing you one of the things such as a new class. So class, I'm going to use an example that you'll find in different places on the web. For me, it's more about showing you what's happening under the hood as opposed to trying to come up with new innovative samples. So I've got my class. Next thing we'll do is create a constructor. Straight away you're seeing the IntelliSense at play. So I'm going to create a constructor with a public variable called greeting, and we're going to type that as a string. Next, I want to create a new method, which I'll be calling later on in my code, and we'll call it, say, greet. And inside this method, we're going to do something simple like return a h1 tag, so a nice heading 1, plus this dot greeting, and then obviously we'd need to close off that h1 tag as well, which is usually where I forget a parentheses or a bracket, and then Mehul starts dictating how I need to code. Okay, there we have a class written in TypeScript. We need to do something with it. So let's start out by creating a new variable called greeter. And here we're going to instantiate the class. So, and we're going to pass in, I'm going to just pause for a second. I'm typing the code, but already IntelliSense has picked up the class that I created. It's noted the constructor, and it's giving me that smart feedback to say, you need to pass in this type of object. I'm purposely going to ignore that and just pass in a number. And then down here we may want to do something like set up the document body in a HTML to be greeter.greet. Now Mehul, as far as code readability goes, you've played around with JavaScript, you're not that familiar with TypeScript necessarily, but is that not readable?
Oh, absolutely. And I think that point you made earlier about if you're moving from, let's say, client side, WinForms, C# over to, straight JavaScript, this is going to feel a lot more familiar to you. I mean, it's made by the same guy, right? Anders Hallsberg. So I think, yeah, absolutely. You get the ability to make a class. The IntelliSense is great right there. So yeah, already I think that's one of the things that's impressed me about it, from not really having used TypeScript that much before.
Now, while the IDE is actually showing me that error, I'm going to see what happens when I build, and we're going to see that, hey, I'm going to straight away get a build error inside that telling me that I've got my type incorrect. So instead we'll come along and replace that now with a string. We'll say, hello Mehul, and hopefully not call you Mehukul, and save that and build. Sometimes hard typing your name, it's not one that I find fluid on the keyboard.
It's okay, I still misspell my name occasionally.
Now, I'm going to refresh inside the Solution Explorer because behind or under the covers, Visual Studio has done that transpilation or that transpile and actually created my .js file for me. So here what I'm going to do is just put them side by side. And this is a great way, especially if you're new to JavaScript, of actually learning more about the language while getting the benefits of TypeScript. We can see under the hood, the JavaScript that's been created implements things like prototypes and the functions needed where we've got our class and constructor, and even down to implementing, well, everything that we've done there is mapped nicely. I mentioned earlier about things like strongly typed and type inference. So if I wanted to replace my hard-coded string there with something of a variable, I could come along and I could say var y as a string equals hello Julian. We're not going to do the comma for Julian. And of course now I'm going to build, and we'll see I've got my strongly typed y because I've nominated that it's a string, and back inside JavaScript it's put everything across. But of course that error checking that's happening at TypeScript is going to mean that I can't accidentally mess that up. One interesting thing here is the fact that I can say var z equals hello Amanda, and as far as JavaScript's concerned, it's exactly the same. If I look, I'm just using IntelliSense on my mouse and hover, you're going to see that type inference is being used. So TypeScript has said, look, you've assigned this as a string on the initial call, therefore this variable will now be a string. Interestingly, if you're doing this in JavaScript, you could reassign Z to anything else, being the dynamic language it is. Now if I go Z equals 1, 2, 3, I'm going to immediately get a compile error because it's detected that, hey, Z, even though it wasn't strongly typed using the same syntax as above, by inference it is a string. So you're going to get that protection all the way through, which I think is really, really important. Does that make sense?
It's a very nice feature. I mean, at compile time, you'll be able to catch some of these errors that you normally might do in the browser dev tools or something like that. So that's fantastic.
And I think even even more so than compile time, you're going to get inside, say, Visual Studio, VS Code, you're going to get that error occurring before you even get to try and debug the product as well, which is really nice. Now, before I hand over to you for the DevExpress side of this, there's a couple of other, or one language feature in particular that I want to call out, and that is the fat arrow.
So Paul, you have to excuse me. I got a bad pun here, but I like fat arrows, and I cannot lie.
Well, the only thing I could respond with is the other functions can't deny.
You know what? We have the makings of a hip-hop group. That's it.
Yeah,
We're forming one.
Anyway, so what I'm going to do is create not a car, but maybe a var, and we'll say T equals P fat arrow P plus 1.
What is that fancy font you got there? Look at that.
I'll show you that in a second. It's pretty cool. Okay, what Lambda expressions are not something new to C# developers. So if you're coming from the C# background, it is cool that you can jump straight in and use these inside your JavaScript or TypeScript applications. And in essence, what we're doing here is we're setting up T to be a function which takes a parameter and adds one to it. So if I wanted to maybe say R equals, no, thank you IntelliSense, sometimes gets in the way, R equals T100, and R would therefore be 101. And of course I have to put var in front of that, otherwise I get told I'm being a naughty programmer. Now, what's going to happen, do you think, on the right-hand side, Mehul, when I say transpile?
Good question. I think it's going to make a function. Is that an anonymous function?
Absolutely. So we have a function being created, and you can see exactly how that Lambda expression is going to be implemented as a JavaScript function, which is really, really cool. Now, you did ask about the font, so I'm going to show you that if I do a lesser or equals, greater or equals, triple equals, or a not equal to, that would make your code a lot easier to read. And I just think that the developer that designed that font has done an amazing job. There is a link to it on one of our slides. It's called Fira, F-I-R-A code, and it's available for download via GitHub. But I love working inside JavaScript or TypeScript with that font in particular.
Oh, I agree. That's a cool little font, and that's such a developer thing, right? We're such nerds about our fonts, and I've got a ton of, I got a Dropbox folder full of them. So, by the way, that the anonymous, not anonymous, the fat arrow thing is so cool. It's not only does it save you from writing function, but you can use this cool syntax, and it kind of reminds me of like the ternary operator. Like there's some cool little code-specific things you can do to make
Absolutely.
your TypeScript
I think
nice. All right, let me grab the
more
screen.
people should use it. So let's switch over to you and take us on the next journey, because I think I've provided enough background for people to be jumping straight into TypeScript today.
Oh, absolutely. It's a great introduction. Thank you. So now, as Paul showed us, how easy it is to get started with TypeScript. It's really, you can take your, and as you mentioned, take your existing JavaScript, change the name of the file from .js to .ts, and things will still work. And you can build from there and start taking advantage of the IntelliSense and the other items. So what I want to talk about is what we have offered for our DevExpress ASP.NET Web Forms and MVC controls. And in the last major release, 16.1, we released support for TypeScript with our ASP.NET controls for their client-side events and client-side objects. So what that means is almost all DevExpress ASP.NET controls have some form of, well, if they have some form of client-side functionality or events, then there's a client-side object. So for example, if the object is ASPX grid view, then you can pretty much insert the word client in the middle, and there'll exist a object like ASPX client grid view or ASPX client list box. And then they'll have events like selection changed and so forth. And so you, the DevExpress customers, may not always be aware, and you typically would have to go to our documentation to learn more about it. But Visual Studio is a fantastic tool, And we wanted to make it easier for our customers to simply be writing code inside of Visual Studio and be able to discover the same way you would a server-side control. A server-side .NET control gives you the ability to hit dot and control space and get a list of those properties and what their definition might be and what kind of parameter they're expecting. So TypeScript gives you that, as Paul showed us, and we wanted to do that. So what we did was we made TypeScript definitions and we submitted them to the definitely typed project, which is on GitHub. And there's a ton of definitions out there. And we're proud to say, after the hard work we did to expose all our client-side items via the TypeScript definitions, our project was accepted. And you will now find it hosted inside the definitely typed /devexpress-web. And there's one key file called devexpress-web.d.ts. This is the main file that you need. And there's another file that you find as well, which is the test file. And the test file actually is kind of interesting if you want to take a look at examples of DevExpress client-side controls and events in TypeScript. And you'll see a lot of good examples. And these are the tests that we ourselves run for this file. Okay. On the original blog post, I mentioned that there are 4 ways to get TypeScript enabled for your ASP.NET project using DevExpress ASP.NET products, and that is NuGet. NuGet is my preferred option for this approach. You can, there's a way in Visual Studio, a couple of ways in Visual Studio. You can either type, install NuGet package, or you can go to the new NuGet package manager, which I'll show in just a second. Or wherever you install DevExpress, for example, in program files, DevExpress 16.1, under component sources, under the DevExpress Web ASPX script IntelliSense, you'll find that file that I mentioned, which is the TypeScript definitions file. Or as you can just go to GitHub, download the file directly. Just download the raw file directly, save it somewhere in your project, and reference it. Oh, and finally, you can, using the TypeScript definitions manager, use this command: typings install web global, all that good stuff. I tend to prefer, again, the NuGet way. It seems to be the easiest way. And so let's do that. So I want to show you an example of this using a DevExpress ASP.NET control, a very common one called the grid view. So here we've got the grid view. And in this example, when I click a checkbox, you can see that it takes the value from this column and adds it to this list box and ups this counter. So every time I do that, you'll see the values get added and the counter goes up. And what's nice about it is that the page is not refreshing. It's doing a callback. And so if we take a look at the source code, which you can do easily with all our demos, you'll find that there is, and I apologize, don't worry about this small bit of code. We're going to be doing all this in Visual Studio, so I'll explain a little bit of this code. But all we've got here is a grid view, we've got a list box, and we've got some JavaScript code. And the JavaScript code essentially says, listen, when the selection has changed, get some field values, add them to the list box, and then up the span element with the counter. So let's take this example, recreate it in Visual Studio, but let's use TypeScript and using the new definitions file, and you'll see how this benefits you going forward in working with DevExpress ASP.NET controls with Visual Studio and the client side. All right, so the first thing we want to do is I'm just going to start from a file new project, and I'll go with the DevExpress template gallery, and I'm going to use a simple name. We're going to make an empty project, so let's just call it DX ASP TypeScript. And I'll use an empty project, and I'm using the DevExpress Web Forms empty projects because I just wanted to set it up. So it's going to create pretty much a bare bones project. You can see there won't be anything in there. And I'll just change the theme to material. I kind of like the material theme, but you can choose whichever one you prefer. And it's going to essentially set up the project with our references and the web config so that we can start using DevExpress controls. Now, you don't have to. You can actually start from the Microsoft side as well. And when you add a control to the designer, it will set it up as well. So the first thing I want to do, as we expect, is add a default ASPX page. So we'll just call this default. And then I can go to the designer and start adding some controls. Now, Paul, if you're working with a web forms project, do you still use the designer much these days?
Afraid not. My preference is definitely the source window, and I find that there's only the odd control now that I have to switch through to the designer to access a couple of things. But I also find there's a weird bug in Visual Studio that once you've been in the design view and switch back to source, saving files can take up to 20 seconds, which is really frustrating as a dev.
Yeah, I think the designer can be very useful in certain scenarios, and I agree with you. If I've got a large amount of HTML or controls on there, Visual Studio can sometimes get disconnected between sort of the source and the design, but otherwise, if I'm just starting out a new page and I'm adding a control, I'll tend to kind of prefer to do it from the toolbox, because when you drop a control from the toolbox onto the designer, it kicks off this process where it'll create the licenses file, it'll add the references, it'll update the web config with any other information that might be necessary, and then I'll just continue working from the source side. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab a little bit of HTML here. So in here I've got a div, I got a list box, and I'm just going to copy this bit of code here to save a little time, because here we just got an empty list box. I'm going to change this div and list box, and now you can see that I've just got a couple of things set up, a little text, but I still got the list box. It has a client instance name property set. Now, if you're not familiar, client instance name essentially says, listen, I want you to create a client-side object and expose it because I'll be using some client-side events and or properties. So this is a very useful thing, and giving it a name helps us refer to it via client-side code, JavaScript or TypeScript. And then we've got essentially just a span that we're using as the counter, and that's the part that gets updated. Now, if we take a look at this in the design again, you can just see I saved a little bit of time. Now, the next thing is, obviously, we want some data in our grid view. Now, I'm going to use the typical Northwind database, so I'm just going to grab a existing item. Now, if you just go into the DevExpress demos folder, you'll find our DevExpress Northwind database, and it's all over the place. You can find it in all sorts of places, and we'll likely include it if I can put this project up on GitHub, and I'll include it with that as well. But it's a standard Microsoft Northwind database. And now, because I've got it in app data, when I go and hit new data source and select SQL data source, I will have it exposed, available to me right through this drop down. So I'm going to select Northwind, I'll select next, save the connection string, and now it's going to update the web config with a connection string, get a list of the available tables within the database. And as soon as Visual Studio catches up here, it'll tell us, oh, here, you've got these available to us. So now we're going to go with customers. I'm going to say, I'll select some fields like customer name or customer ID, contact name, and city, and let's go with country. All right. So now let's just quickly test the query. The one column that's important that I really would prefer is contact name. So I got contact name, and now I'll hit finish. And once I do, the grid will update. Now, because whenever I make a change like this, I always like to make sure that this runs. Now, the reason I like to do everything sort of from scratch is to kind of show you like I've got nothing up the sleeve, and you can kind of see that it's very easy to get started. Now, as you saw from our demo, we are going to need some checkboxes, and we're going to need to wire up. So let's do that. Obviously, the first thing we want to do is enable the checkboxes. So we'll simply do that by going show select checkbox, and now that we got the checkboxes, how does the code actually work? Well, as we saw in the thing, we're going to need some bit of JavaScript code. So let's grab this JavaScript code, and as Paul mentioned, I could right now just take this code, stick it in Visual Studio in a TypeScript file, and I would have it. Now let me make this a little bit more readable. So I'll set the syntax to JavaScript, and we'll get a little bit more colorful items. And I'm showing this here to kind of show you what it looks like between the things. So word wrap is on. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to take this bit of code and convert it to TypeScript to show you how easy it is. Now, obviously, I could just paste it, but that won't really be useful. So the first thing is we've got to make sure that our objects are set up. So our server-side object already has a client instance name. So I want to make sure my grid does as well. And I'll give it a name. And I could call it CS grid, or in this case, I'll just call it lowercase grid. And now the grid has an object available as well. Now I also need a client-side event, which I can set through the properties windows here. But in this case, I'd like to show you, if you haven't seen, if you go through the Smart tag and click the designer link, you'll see this new designer that we've made. Now, if I click on client-side events and if I scroll down, you'll see the selection changed event. Now, in this case, I'm just going to put a little useless comment just to show you that, when you do this, and if you go back to the source view, you'll see the grid view will add this item for us. So let's make this a little bit more readable. And here, I can make a inline function. But I've got some amount of JavaScript code, so I don't want to make it too long. So let's make this a little bit more useful. And I'm going to change the way we're calling this item. So instead of calling this function, let's instead remove the function altogether and just give it a name called grid selection changed. Now this event doesn't exist. Now I can come up in the head section, type JavaScript, and start making the function, but that's not a best practice. As Julian has showed in other webinars before, what you want to do is you want to separate that code out into a separate file, especially if you have any large amount of code. So to do that, and before we do that, what I'm first going to do is I'm going to get my project set up for TypeScript with DevExpress TypeScript, and then I'll make a TypeScript file and we'll add the code there. So as I mentioned, I prefer NuGet, and I'm going to right click here and I'm going to go to Manage NuGet Packages, which brings up this NuGet Package Manager. So first is I'm going to make sure I'm on the Browse tab. Now here you want to type in the name DevExpress-web.TypeScript. That's DevExpress-web.TypeScript, and it'll bring up the specific project that I mentioned. And look at that, Paul. We got all 2,500 downloads. That's awesome. So it is pretty cool. More people have been using this than I knew. So let's hit install. Now what nice about this is it's gonna give you sort of like a little review changes here. But and once I hit OK, it's gonna grab this package and install it. And as Paul mentioned, it's also you're gonna need something called TypeScript typings. Now when he created a new project, he created a TypeScript project type, so it already included it. My project didn't have any TypeScript. And because I'm going to use TypeScript, I want to say yes and make sure that that's included. And so now I've got all the necessary typings, and we can go ahead and start adding TypeScript to this. So I'm going to right click on script here. I'm going to say add and just select TypeScript file, and I'll call it main. And what's nice is it'll create that main.ts and give us that nice icon, and we can go ahead and start adding our code. So Paul, I've got my possibly last and second pun of the day, and that is I gotta do it, Paul, because normally we really avoid showing us typing code, because who wants to sit here and watch somebody write code? But really, the magic of this is using TypeScript in Visual Studio to see all the benefits of it. So not only am I going to write code, Paul, I'm going to type script. I'm sorry, Paul, it's in the name. I think Anders knew what he was doing when he called it TypeScript. Okay, sorry for the bad pun. So let's get started. The first thing is we have said we need grid selection changed. So let's just start right there and just say, listen, okay, I've got a function. Now, as I do this, you can see I get the nice intelligence that Paul mentioned, and then I've got my grid selection changed event. Now, typically, and here, let me give you some side-by-side action here. Make this a little bit shorter. Oops. And let's put this guy back. All right, I apologize. My window management isn't the best here. All right, so we've got essentially a couple of parameters that we're passing in here, and that is S and E. Now, if you're typically before, you'd have to look up and say, what the heck was S and E and so forth. Well, if you take a look at our documentation, which is always going to be linked, and we've done this with all our demos, that our properties are linked, our selection change event is linked, and they'll take you direct to the direct topics in our online demos, and you'll see all of the items that this is expecting. And so, for example, selection changed takes a couple of parameters, and in it we can pass in an array of string of column names, and then also a callback event on which those array items will be sent back. And so in this case, we're asking for the contact name. And so grid selection change is going to make a callback to the server side, grab those values, and then on a separate callback, it's going to send back those values, and then we can decide on the client side what to do. So in this case, this callback is one we're handling that says, okay, this array value that you gave me, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that list box, clear it, and then loop through it, add those values, and end it. And so it's a very nice little feature that we're going to take advantage of. So we know S is the sender, and we said this is coming from the grid. So what we can do is we can take this concept a little bit further and say, let's take what TypeScript is aware of and make it smarter by telling it what we're expecting. So here I can give it a type, ASPX client grid view. Now, as you saw, as I started typing there, here's all of the DevExpress items. No longer do you have to go around on our website and go, okay, well, what is the thing that's available and what does it do? Now it's in Visual Studio, and that's awesome. I mean, I love that feature. So we can go even further and even define the event args. So initially you might say, well, what is the event args? But if you look at any of these methods, you'll find very easily the client grid view selection event args class, and we can just use that to set it up. Okay, now we've made TypeScript smart. We've told TypeScript what this thing is, and so it can be smarter about it. So let me make this a little larger. And Julian had a great comment yesterday that let's make this as large as possible. All right, and you can do something like this if it's too wide for you. All right, next is we just need to pass in get selected field values, right? So let's do that. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit S. And as soon as I hit dot, look at that. This is all of the client grid views, properties, events, and so forth. So now I can say get selected field values. And as I do, I'm just going to pause here and take a look at that. I've got the method definition telling me, listen, I need a string of field names. What field names do you want me to go get? And when I get them, how do I give them back to you? What's the grid view callback? And so returns the row values displayed within all selected rows. And that's exactly what I want. So that's what we'll do. So I'll do that. I'll paste in the other item, which is I'm looking for the contact name, and give it back to me on grid selected field values callback. Now this doesn't exist yet. That's what we need to define next. So let's do that. So we're going to go function again, grid selected field values, and it's going to send us back the values. So I'm going to create a property here called values, and simply just create this function. Now, before we go further, we know what cell list is. If you remember, cell list is just our list box, and it's a client instance version of it. So do you remember I said that you can take essentially most server-side controls and put the word client in them? So let's do that. And because TypeScript is smart, we can declare a variable. And so we'll say, hey, listen, there's a variable out there already existing called cell list, and it is of type ASPX, and we can't say list box. That's the server-side object. So we're going to call it client. And if you hit Control Space, it'll go find it and say, oh, well, that's very nice. And so now I can do the same thing for the grid as well. I'll say declare var grid ASPX client grid view. And so because we've defined these, I can come in here and say, instead of just cell list, I can find out whether cell list supports that. So at at design time, while I'm writing code, I can say, listen, I'm going to begin an update, and then I'm going to go through and do a try finally and clear some items and all that stuff. So for saving some code time, I'll paste this in there. But you can see that if I was typing in and I had Control Space, I'd get that clear items, I'd get that dot add items, and so forth. So now you can see we're just clearing this list and then looping through the items and getting the values and finishing the update. Now, the final thing is what we want to make sure is in this same item, we've got that nice little span. So let's go to the document object, and we're going to get element by ID. And if you remember the element, the specific element was cell count. So we can get the cell count and update its inner HTML. So that's exactly what we're going to do. So we're going to say, find me cell count, update its inner HTML, and we're going to set it equal to grid.get selected row count. Great. Now look at this. It's exactly the same line. Now, as Paul mentioned, I could have just copied that over here, but somehow TypeScript is still not happy. And that's because TypeScript is being helpful here. And what it's telling us is, hey, look, inner HTML is a string. You can't take something that returns a number and assign it to a string. Well, as Paul mentioned, we can, if we're coming from like C# or something, the first thing we'd expect to do is go something like dot to string, and look at that, it's there. So I think you're really gonna like, and some things that you expect to work are gonna be there. So now it's type safe and it's aware. Now, if I was to run this right now, nothing would happen because all we've done is created the code. And while it's great, you can see how easy TypeScript is to create, to actually see it in action, we got to make sure that we install it. So, we reference it. Now, what that means is when you've got a JavaScript file, you got to make sure that you've included it in here. So what I just want to do is I'm going to make sure I come into here, grab main.ts, and drop it in the section here. Now you saw that I grabbed main.ts, but the reference it made was main.js. And that's not a mistake because as Paul showed, when you first compile, so let's just compile. We'll let Control B here. And as it's compiling, what it did is if I show all files, you'll see that I've got main.ts and I've got main.js. And this main.js looks exactly like that demo code we were looking at before. So now we've got everything in place. Let's just take a quick look at this in action. And we should have our updated grid view and list box working together. And I'm going to turn on the DevTools console so we can see any possible errors. All right, so now as I hit this, you can see I get the contact name value in the list box added. My counter is going up as I do this. And we easily did that all in Visual Studio because I had the capability to see those definitions. And that's why I think TypeScript is fantastic if you're using DevExpress ASP.NET controls and trying to do any client side with it. Now, Paul, let me ask you something. How do you feel about trying a little advanced JavaScript?
Well, maybe some advanced TypeScript, because straight away, looking at that method, I think you could become a TypeScript guru and shortcut that horrible loop in the middle.
As our resident JavaScript expert, Mr. Bucknall, suggested yesterday, he said, listen, you know what? JavaScript is an evolving language, and there are some things, there's even newer iterators out there that you can take advantage of. For example, this for loop is it's fine, it works plenty well. But let's do this. Let's first make, whoops, I don't want to do the try. We're just going to comment out the for loop, and instead what we can do is we can use what's called a for each. Now, for each is going to allow us to say, listen, for every item, we're going to grab this. And essentially what it is, it's like well, it uses the fat arrows, but it essentially, in one line of code, we're going to be able to do the same thing. So not only does it look slick, but you'll have less lines of code while still have it be readable. So for each is available on the objects. How should I say this? Let's say array objects and so forth. So I know what values is bringing back to me is an array of object. Now, in this case, it's bringing me an array of string. So what I can do here is say, listen, values, when it comes in, it is actually a string array. And now that I've defined it as a string array there, I can come here and say values dot, and I get the capability to do for each. Now, as we can see from this definition, it provides a string value that we pass in, an index, and this fat arrow over into sort of a function argument, right? And in this case, we're going to do something specific. So instead of add item, we're going to do it over here. All right, so it's kind of a slick item, and initially you may be going like, what? What does this do? So let's do this. So obviously in the first part is, what is the object? Well, in this case, contact name is the object that we're going to be looking for. And that's essentially, think of it like an iterator. Now, in this case, I'm going to typecast it and say, listen, contact name is string. Now, this is sort of the value inside of values that we're extracting. And next, we're going to do a fat arrow and say, listen, now that you've got the contact name, what I want you to do is take this select list, add it. So we're doing the exact same thing that we did before with the values at I, but instead we are grabbing it directly from the string array because we're doing a value for each value. I'm sorry, for each contact name in values, grab it and put it inside using add item. So then we can simply say contact name. Now I hope I haven't confused anyone, but as you can see, it's much slicker, and we can just remove this code now. But you can see now with one line of code, I'm looping through the same set of values, but just doing it in sort of a more modern TypeScript, JavaScript approach. All right, Paul, what do you think of that?
Would look great if you had the correct font installed.
I do need to check out your Fira font. So it's an open source font? Awesome. All right, let me run this for one last time, and then we will open it up for questions. And now you can see I've got the exact same functionality. And if we take a look at the dev tools again, look at that, no errors. And that's what we're looking for. We're looking for help at compile time to know that what the code we wrote, the variables we created are there. And Paul, I really like what you mentioned, that we can use modern ECMAScript standards available to us right through TypeScript. And I'm simply just writing TypeScript because as JavaScript evolves and new things are coming out, let and all these things, it's great that I can stick with this syntax and have it available to me as well.
Absolutely.
Hey,
and the discoverability portion of that, when you're doing more and more things on the client UI, the fact that the TypeScript definitions saves so much time running back and forth to documentation. It's a huge time saving. In fact, one developer once said to me, if you're not using TypeScript, you're literally burning money.
Paul, I hope one day I'll be able to just burn money, because I might just not use TypeScript. I might just burn money instead. But you're right. No, I absolutely agree with you. Why in development we're always looking for things to help us write better code. And if you are writing a large amount of code, and yes, there are. We've talked before. There are some people, and in fact, let me put it like, for me, I initially thought, okay, here's an abstraction. Why would I use this abstraction? Is it yet another language I need to learn, right? But as you mentioned, Paul, it's a superset, right? So if you know JavaScript, and as we saw in this demo here, you're going to be pretty much comfortable, because if you know JavaScript, if you know C#, it's not a huge leap, and it's something that can help you. And hey, Paul, wasn't there something about the Angular team adopting this?
Yes, so the Angular 2 team used TypeScript to produce Angular 2. And in fact, the story goes that they uncovered some pretty deep bugs inside the original code base for Angular when they started switching as well. So by its nature and the typing makes it a lot nicer to use on large-scale projects where it's quite easy to get lost as to what you're supposed to be passing around, which is what we sort of covered earlier on. But that whole essence of code separation into those files and easier, cleaner code to write, less issues with discoverability, I think, is the main things, and so easy to implement as you did. NuGet, find the package, install, done. And I was talking to a dev just actually this week, and he, based on some of the discussions, he swapped to doing just that, removing the TypeScript code out of the markup in his default, like his ASPX pages, putting out separate files, and it really was a joy to see how easily it can be done. And of course, same thing with just the same principle with the CSS and so forth.
I'll simply mention one last thing is that this is available with DevExpress ASP.NET Web Forms controls and DevExpress ASP.NET MVC controls. And, we have a new controls coming out called wrappers, but those are based on DevExtreme. I'm talking about the existing set of controls, and because they have a similar interface on the client. In fact, on the client side, it's the same interface, but on the server side, they have a similar set of properties and methods and so forth. So yes, this applies to both web forms and MVC, and everything that I showed here today will apply for the DevExpress MVC grid view as well.
So the questions have been pretty light on, Mehul. One that came in just before was when you were doing some of the code examples, would it apply exactly the same way inside MVC? And of course the answer is yes, it's exactly the same principle that you would access those controls in the client interface. And Jemmy just asked, is there any reason for not using TypeScript?
I'll let you take that one.
The answer is no. I cannot think of any reason why you would not implement TypeScript into your project and stick with JavaScript. Even to the point where I think we've got Mr. Bucknell convinced that he needs to do more TypeScript development. So, being as hardcore as he is at JavaScript, we'll no doubt have some banter on that on our next. In fact, Julian and I are doing a presentation in a couple of weeks on the next progression of taking a WinForms developer over to DevExtreme for web. So yeah, there's lots of things happening in the web world. So it's really a matter of sitting where you are. And the interesting thing with all of that, of course, is when it comes to whether you would stick with the web forms, MVC, or whether you go pure HTML client side, at the end of the day, JavaScript is here to stay. It won the war. Silverlight is dead. Flash is dead. So whether we like it or not, we have to get our head around some form of JavaScript. Why not make your life easy and implement TypeScript?
Let me just add on to that. I agree with everything you said there. But in essence, when you're asking the general question of, should I learn language X or, abstraction Y, especially in all these days, I think the real question most people are thinking is this worth my time? Is this something that's going to be around? And in essence, Microsoft is committed to it. And to the point, and TypeScript is really good to the point that Angular 2.0 team. So there's a bromance happening with Google and Microsoft. I mean, how crazy is that a core team from Google is using a Microsoft technology just because it's so good. And it's open source. So,
that's
it's not...
the key thing. It's open source.
Yeah, exactly. So we can't tell you what to adopt. We can only tell you the benefits. Obviously, you'll have to make that choice. But, it looks like TypeScript will definitely be around. But, Microsoft doesn't easily kill languages, right? So meaning that, if they do stop supporting it, it doesn't mean developers stop using it. And it finds life. So TypeScript is going to be around as long as JavaScript's going to be around. And, you can probably expect JavaScript to be around quite a bit. Well, until something better comes along, but nobody knows what that is yet, right?
Maybe Mehul script.
Yeah. So let me put up the links post here. So Paul, I'll let you take the definitions right there and all that.
Okay, so obviously link number one, devexpress.com. Download any of our tools. If you haven't yet played around with our ASP.NET controls in any flavor, there's just so much going on, implementation of the dashboard things and all sorts of cool stuff. TypeScriptLang.org is the home of TypeScript. You'll find some of the simple example I used today, but lots of documentation examples. The definition files for DevExpress, the TypeScript-ASP, I've put the type definitions there. It's actually Mehul's blog post, which also has a link to the definition files, but of course you can access them with NuGet and all those other ways that Mehul talked about. And we lost our slide.
Oh, I'm sorry. That's right. You needed that.
And of course, for those interested, the font that I love is, there's a short link for that as well. Now, of course, Jebby's just made a comment, Azure App Services plus DX Controls plus TypeScript equals powerful apps, and yes, it does. Now, there are some more webinars over the next few weeks. We've got some cool stuff happening. There's Report Server, an introduction to Report Server with Don, and then we've got a MV introduction. We'll scroll down. So WinForms apps with MVVM with Don, who's taking over a webinar page. And then, of course, getting started with DevExtreme Web, which is going to be a continuation of TypeScript, but how to implement your C# knowledge base in a pure client-side, lightweight environment. So check that out. And Amanda, is there anything else you want to add?
Hey guys, thank you very much. Well, you pretty much covered it. I did want to say that this webinar, if you want to watch it again or share it with someone else, it will be available later today on our DevExpress YouTube channel. And I will post that link in the chat box. And as Paul showed you, you can check out devexpress.com/webinars for all of our upcoming sessions.
And can we get rid of Mehul's bad puns before we post it, or do they have to stay?
I'll probably leave them.
Okay.
I mean, they were pretty good.
I apologize, but I can't help it. You know, we have fun on these webinars, and I appreciate everybody who's joined. So thank you, Amanda. Thank you, everybody who's joined.
Awesome. Thank you, Mehul. All right, everybody, that is it for this one. Thank you so much to Mehul and Paul, and thank you all for joining us. And of course, thank you for choosing DevExpress. Bye-bye.